The manifest said we were carrying pressed fiber construction, so 412 units of industrial sealant compound, and 1 partial consignment of calibration equipment for the relay towers on Hadrath 9. 91 days haul from Marethis Station, and the only interesting thing that happened in that entire window was when our cook, a man named Pryor, who had been cooking on freighters since before I was born, dropped an entire pot of reconstituted lentils on his own boot, and didn't say a word about it for 11 minutes. I counted. I had the time. That's the thing people don't understand about cargo work until they've done it. The days are long, and the work is specific, and most of what you carry is not interesting. And most of where you go is not scenic, and most of the people you work with have already told you everything they're going to tell you somewhere in the first month of a 6-month contract. After that you get comfortable in a different way. Comfortable the way a piece of machinery gets comfortable. Everything in its place, running at the right temperature, making the right sounds. The Varanthioho was that kind of comfortable. I knew which deck plates gave slightly under load, and which didn't. Which ventilation junction made a sound, like a card being shuffled once an hour, at intervals I could set my watch by. Which crew bunk was closest to the heat exchanger, and therefore warmer in the winter, and warmer in the summer, and always slightly too warm regardless of season. I knew the manifest rhythm, how long each type of cargo took to verify, how a load plan discrepancy felt before I'd finished reading it, the specific texture of a clean bill versus one that was going to require a notation. I had been working the hull for 3 years by the time we made the Kethvorath run. Third cargo hand, which sounds minor until you understand that, on a ship with a crew of 11, there is no such thing as a role that doesn't matter. My job was the manifest. I kept it, updated it, cross-checked it against the load plans, and made sure that what we said we were carrying matched what was actually in the hold. It is a job that requires patience more than anything else, and a tolerance for numbers that most people do not have. I had both. Captain Vera Mosfeld said once that I could find a discrepancy in a bill of lading the way some people can find a wrong note in a piece of music. Not by thinking about it, just by listening. I took that as a compliment. Vera did not give compliments for things she didn't mean. The Varanthi Hall was not a young ship. She had been commissioned in the same year that the compact transit charter was still being argued over at the negotiation tables, back when the Sethali had not yet decided whether to admit human vessels to their transit lanes at all. She had been built by the Morith Dellen yards at Orbital Station Carith 6, which no longer existed, and she had been refitted twice in her life. Once after a pressure seal failure in her forward cargo compartment, and once after a collision with a debris field that had dented her starboard bow, plating into a shape that the repair team had described in the technical report as aerodynamically unusual. That was the polite version. The rest of the crew called it something else. She was, by any honest accounting, a ship of a certain age. Her hull plating carried the layered surface texture that comes from decades of thermal cycling, the barely perceptible stratification, like old paint, of many recoatings over many years. Her communications array was not modern. It used a transmission architecture that had been standard when she was built, and had since been revised twice, though everything it needed to transmit reached where it was going without difficulty. Her cargo crane mechanisms had a vibration frequency that our engineer, Delka Soreth, described as personalized, meaning she had been working with it long enough to know exactly what it should sound like, and to hear immediately when it didn't. The drive system was solid. Dellen Grade 3, built to tolerances that the current generation of designers still cited as a Caribizedmo reference standard, with the kind of accumulated maintenance documentation that told a complete story of a machine being looked after, rather than merely operated. She was, in short, a ship that had been doing what she was built to do for a very long time, and had the evidence to prove it. None of this was by itself interesting to me. I knew what the Hall was. I had been on her for 3 years, and before that I had read her documentation before signing on. Because that is what you do when you take a job on a vessel, and you are the kind of person who wants to understand what they're working with. She was a good ship. The evidence supported this conclusion. The manifest supported this conclusion. The maintenance record supported this conclusion. The fact that orbital station Carith 6 no longer existed, and the Hall was still running transit routes, was perhaps the most succinct support this conclusion could have asked for. There is a kind of competence that does not announce itself. I had worked on 2 other ships before the Hall. A newer vessel out of Farith Station that had beautiful systems and a crew that spent considerable energy explaining to each other and to their cargo counterparts how beautiful the systems were, and a mid-range hauler that was honestly mediocre in every respect and had the morale to match. The Hall was different from both. She was not a ship anyone talked about in terms of pride or capability, except Delka, who talked about the drive tolerances with the quiet satisfaction of an engineer who knows what she's maintaining and why it matters. She was simply a ship that did the work, and the crew was simply a crew that did the work, and the work got done. This was, I had come to understand, a rarer thing than it should have been. I thought about this occasionally during the 91-day transit. Then, I thought about the manifest, and the manifest was more immediately relevant, and the Carith 6 line of reasoning returned to the part of my mind where things are kept until they re-needed. Kethvorath was a Sethali compact transfer station, which meant it was large, cold, and organized in the way that only a species with a crystalline nervous system and a deep cultural allergy to inefficiency could manage. The Sethali were one of the older compact members, and they wore that seniority the way certain people wear a very expensive coat, not to keep warm, but to make sure you noticed. The station itself was beautiful, in the way that a precisely cut diamond is beautiful. All hard angles and internal refraction. Every corridor calibrated to the optimal traffic flow for beings whose appendages moved in a very specific range of motion. For humans, navigating Kethvorath meant a constant low-grade awareness that the architecture was not designed for you, and that this was not an accident. We came into berth at 1700 station time, on a compact calendar 3rd day. The approach had taken longer than usual because the traffic control queue was backed up with vessels from the Vainvar trading convoy, a group of compact freighters, so new their hull markings still had the sheen of fresh application. Watching them queue ahead of us on the approach vector, I was struck by the specific quality of their newness. There is a visual difference between a ship that has been in service for years and one that has not yet accumulated the small, honest signs of continuous use, and the Vainvar convoy had clearly not yet accumulated them. They were pristine in the way that things are pristine before they encounter anything, which is to say, not yet tested. We slid into berth 47, our assigned berth, the same berth the Hall had used on every Kethvorath transit for the past 19 years. And I started the unload prep, while the docking clamps were still settling. The Sethali inspection team came aboard at 1900. There were 4 of them. The Sethali were crystalline in a way that was not immediately obvious. Their surface layer had the matte quality of unpolished quartz, and their internal light refracting system was visible only when they moved in a certain way, a faint prismatic shimmer along the joints of their limbs. They stood about 1.80 meters, roughly human height, but their proportions were different. Longer in the torso, shorter in the leg, with 3-fingered hands that moved with the careful deliberation of beings who had evolved in an environment where unnecessary motion was a waste of energy. They communicated vocally through a translator matrix, and what came through the matrix was always grammatically precise. The grammar was the courtesy. The tone was something else. The lead inspector was called Varithson. I know this because it was on his identification document, which he presented to Captain Mossfeld at the top of the boarding ramp, with the exact energy of someone submitting evidence in a proceeding, rather than introducing himself to a fellow professional. He had two junior inspectors behind him. I did not catch their names, because they were not introduced, and an administrative recorder at the rear, whose job appeared to be logging everything on a handheld device that made a faint, clicking sound. With every entry, Vera received them with the same expression she used for weather reports and fuel cost estimates. Informative, attentive, no particular feeling about it. Captain Mossfeld, said Vereth-san through the matrix. Varanthi Hall, Registry Kareth 6. Class designation Morith Dellen Grade 3 Freighter. Commission date. He paused, and the pause had a quality to it that I recognized from a very specific kind of person. The pause that is not uncertainty, but theater. Commission date Compact Standard Year 4402. That's right, said Vera. That is, Vereth-san said, 71 years ago. Also right. He looked at her for a moment. The Sethali equivalent of a facial expression was a shift in the refraction pattern along the cheekbone ridge, narrowing of the internal light scatter, which in Vereth-san's case indicated something that the cultural briefing documents described as assessment. I had read those documents. I found them useful. We will begin the formal inspection, he said. You will make all compartments accessible. Vera said she would, and they began. I have been on ships when inspections happened before, and the word inspection covers a wide range of actual activities. Some inspections are thorough and professional. The inspectors come in, they check what they're supposed to check, they note what they find, they leave. Some are cursory, and some are what I can only describe as a performance, in which the inspection itself is less about the condition of the vessel than about establishing, in a documented and official record, who holds the evaluation authority in the room. The Kethvoreth inspection was the third kind. Verethson began in the cargo hold. He walked the full length of it, with his recorder taking notes behind him, and he said nothing for a long time. He looked at the ceiling, which was functional, and had been resealed at the last refit, and showed no anomalies. He looked at the deck plating, which was worn smooth in the traffic lanes, and had the honest surface of something that had been loaded and unloaded several hundred times. He looked at the cargo securing hardware, which was, in the assessment of every certifying inspector who had ever examined it, compliant and serviceable, and doing exactly what cargo securing hardware is supposed to do. He looked at all of these things with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who is looking for something specific. And I watched him look. And I waited. He stopped in front of a section of wall paneling near the aft loading door. A panel that had a hairline stress mark along its lower edge. A mark that had been there since the debris field collision. That had been inspected and certified as non-structural on 4 separate occasions, and that was documented in the maintenance log, with more thorough notation than most ships give to their primary drive systems. This panel, Vereth-san said. Hairline stress mark, I said, because Vera had sent me along to hold the manifest and answer questions, and that was what I was for. Non-structural, inspection certified, last logged compact standard 4471. The full notation is in the maintenance record if you want it. He looked at the panel. He looked at me. The refraction pattern, along his cheekbone ridge, narrowed further than the assessment notation. This was something else, something the cultural documents had not given me a precise name for, but that I recognized from the way humans look at things they have already decided about. He said, through the matrix, with the grammar still precisely correct, "It is remarkable that this vessel is still considered serviceable," I said. "She's certified as serviceable, has been continuously for 71 years. He made a sound that the matrix did not translate. This happened occasionally with the Sethali. When a vocalization fell outside the matrix's cultural equivalency parameters, it simply didn't render, and you were left with the sound itself, which in this case was something between a harmonic click and the noise a filing cabinet makes when a drawer is shut with more force than is strictly necessary. He moved on. The inspection took 2 full days. I say 2 full days not as an approximation, but because that was the actual duration. 47 hours, with Verith-san and his team rotating through the inspection in shifts, which meant that at any given hour, station cycle, there was at least one Sathali inspector, somewhere on the hall, logging observations into the handheld device. They inspected the cargo hold, the engine compartment, the pressure seal junctions, the crew quarters, the navigation bay, the communications array, the water reclamation system, the emergency beacon housing, and the galley, where Pryor looked at them with the expression of a man watching rain come in under a door he's already repaired twice and knows will hold. The crew quarters inspection lasted 40 minutes. Our quarters were small. A ship with a crew of 11 and a cargo-to-passenger ratio heavily weighted toward cargo does not have spacious accommodation. But they were maintained, clean, and in the case of my own bunk, organized in the specific way that a person who works with documents organizes things. By category, by frequency of use, with enough redundancy in the physical filing system that nothing important could be lost to a single point of failure. The junior inspector who handled the quarters section looked at my bunk with an expression. I couldn't read through the refraction system, made a note on his device, and moved on. I do not know what the note said. I can guess. The communications array inspection was more thorough. The Sathali were communications engineers, in a way that humans were mechanics. It was embedded in their technical culture at a level that meant they inspected a communications system the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for things that were functionally irrelevant, but diagnostically meaningful. They ran the array through its full frequency range, tested the transmission architecture, measured the encoding latency, and documented the full specification gap between our array's design and the current compact standard. It took 3.5 hours. Our communications officer Marka watched from the doorway, with her arms crossed, and said nothing, which was Marka's usual response to things she had opinions about, that she had decided were not going to be usefully expressed. The Sathali's response to the galley was informative. They did not inspect the food. That was not their mandate. But they inspected the cooking equipment, the storage systems, the atmospheric filtration above the range, and the general organization of the space. The galley was small, and it was old, and it was, in the opinion of everyone who ate in it, a functional and well-maintained space that produced meals that were not remarkable, and were reliably adequate, and were always available on schedule. Verith-san's recorder logged it as consistent with vessel age and operational classification. This was technically neutral. It was the neutrality of someone who has already formed an opinion and is now describing things in the language of a document. Pryor watched them log the filtration system with the patient attention of a man who has seen a great many things and categorizes them without drama. When they left, he refilled the filtration check log, initialed it, and went back to what he was making for dinner. I respected this approach. The log of observations that came out of those 47 hours was extensive. I read it later. I always read the inspection logs, because the inspection log is a document, and documents were my professional responsibility. And it listed, among other things, the stress mark on the cargo hold panel, non-structural, already noted. A surface oxidation patch on the secondary heat exchanger housing, cosmetic, within tolerance, already in the maintenance record. The starboard bow plating contour, described in the inspection log as not consistent with standard Morith-Dellon Grade 3 specifications, which was technically accurate, and also 71 years late as an observation. A vibration frequency in the number 2 cargo crane mechanism that was within operational tolerance but approaching the lower threshold of compact. Standard Efficiency Protocol 11, and, notably, the fact that the hall's communications array used a transmission format that had been current at commission and had since been updated twice, meaning that while the array was fully functional and fully compliant with all required frequencies, its architecture was archaic in both design philosophy and operational idiom. Archaic in both design philosophy and operational idiom. The recorder had logged that one word for word. I read that particular entry 4 times. Not because it surprised me. It was accurate, in the same way that calling the night sky dark is accurate. But because I was interested in the choice to frame it that way. A functional, compliant communications array. Archaic in both design philosophy and operational idiom. The word archaic, doing a great deal of work in a sentence that could also have read, communications array fully functional and compliant with all required compact frequencies. Both sentences described the same object, only one of them had been written. I noted the entry, marked the page, and kept reading. The summary also included, buried in the section on operational profile assessment, a line about the hall's transit history. The Sithali had accessed the station's birth records, as was standard practice in a full inspection, and had noted that the hall had been transiting to Kethvorath regularly for 19 years. The line read, "Vessel has maintained consistent transit patterns, indicative of established operational routine. Pattern does not in itself constitute evidence of current operational adequacy." Which was a very precise way of saying, the fact that she's been coming here for 19 years doesn't mean she should keep coming here. Also accurate. Also, a sentence that could have been written a different way. The observations were not issued to us privately. The Sethali inspection process for compact transit stations required that formal inspection records be filed with the station's administrative registry at the close of each inspection day, which meant that by the end of the first day, Varathson's observations about the Varanthi Hall were available on the station's general information feed to any vessel, crew member, or administrative office that cared to access them. Kethvorath had at that time 83 vessels in berth or transit queue. All 83 of them had access to the inspection feed. I know this because the next morning, when I went to the station's shared crew facility to use their print terminal, I preferred printing the manifest updates rather than reading them off a screen, a preference Vera described as quaint, and I described as accurate. The crew of a Vainvar trading vessel, moored 3 berths over, watched me walk past with the specific quality of attention. That means someone has been talking about you. Not unfriendly attention, curious attention. The kind that comes from having read something interesting about a thing, and then seeing the thing in person and finding it looks more or less as described. I printed my manifest update. I went back to the hall. I did not say anything about it, because there was nothing to say. An inspection log is an inspection log. Varathson had found what he had found, and what he had found was a 71-year-old ship with a stress mark on a panel, an oxidized heat exchanger housing, a non-standard bow profile, and a communications array that was functional and compliant and older than some planetary governments. None of it was wrong. None of it was inaccurate. It was just that the way he had written it. The grammar still exactly correct. Every observation framed as an observation rather than a judgment. The language technically neutral throughout. Made the hall sound like something that ought to be moored in a museum rather than a working berth. On the second day, Varathson found the drive coupling. The drive coupling was, at that point in the hall's life, her one genuine maintenance concern. Not a safety concern. Vera and Delka had run the coupling through every diagnostic available to them, and concluded that it was operating within parameters. But that the parameters were getting narrower on the low end, and that the next scheduled refit, which was planned for Merethis Station 6 months out, should include a coupling replacement. This was sensible maintenance planning. It was, in Delka's precise framing, the difference between looking after a thing and waiting until a thing requires emergency attention. It was in the maintenance log, under future work scheduled. It was not a secret. It was the maintenance record being used as a maintenance record. Veritson found it through his own diagnostic sweep and logged it as primary drive coupling speeding, exhibiting stress variance indicative of advanced material fatigue. Continued operation at current load schedules may present reliability risk within an unspecified future window. Recommendation: immediate assessment by Certified Compact Engineering Authority. Immediate assessment by Certified Compact Engineering Authority, which we had already conducted, by our own engineers, with our own diagnostics, with a comprehensive maintenance log entry that explained the finding, the plan, and the timeline, and which I had pointed out to his recorder on the first inspection day when he had asked about outstanding maintenance items. The recorder had noted that the information had been provided. The recorder had also, apparently, not noted it in a way that made its way into the final log entry, which described the coupling as requiring immediate assessment, as though we had not assessed it, as though the maintenance log did not exist, as though Delka Sorath had not been looking at that coupling. With the focused attention of a woman who knows her drive system, the way most people know their own handwriting, I filed a formal notation of our existing maintenance documentation alongside the inspection record, as was our right under Transit Charter Section 4, Subsection 12, and went back to the manifest. The inspection closed at 1400 on the second day. Veritson assembled his team at the base of our boarding ramp and presented Captain Mossfeld with the full written inspection summary, which was also simultaneously filed with the station registry. The summary was 6 pages. I have read documents of every length and quality in my professional life, and the specific character of a 6-page inspection summary for a vessel that could have been adequately summarized in 2 pages is something I recognized. It was a document designed to be thorough in the way that a display of thoroughness is different from a requirement for thoroughness. It named every item. It described every item in full. It placed every item in the context of current compact standards and noted the degree to which each item met or varied from those standards. It was technically complete. The summary concluded with a formal assessment that the Varanthi was conditionally compliant with minimum compact transit standards, and that the Station Authority's Advisory Board would be reviewing whether berth 47, a Priority 1 classified berth, assigned to the Hall under grandfathered transit charter provisions, remained appropriate for a vessel of this operational profile. Conditionally compliant. Reviewing appropriateness of berth assignment. Vera read the summary. She thanked Veritson. He nodded. The Sethali equivalent, a shift in the refraction along the crown ridge, and he and his team departed back up the station concourse. Vera handed me the summary. File that. Already have a copy. File it next to the transit charter section that says they need 14 days and a full appeals panel to reassign a Priority 1 grandfathered berth. So already flagged it. She looked at me for a moment. How long have you been doing this job? 3 years. You're better at it than the last 3 people combined, she said. I'm going to give you a raise when we get back to Mauritius. I said thank you, and she went back to the bridge, and I sat down with the manifest and the transit charter and went through both of them. For the 4th time that trip, making sure I knew exactly where every relevant clause lived and what its cross-references were, and what the procedural timeline looked like, if anyone ever needed to know. This turned out to be useful the following morning. I was in the cargo hold running the unload schedule. We had started offloading the construction panels, working in coordination with the station's loading crew, a process that, at the hall's pace and with the station crane protocols, was going to take approximately 3 days. When Marka, our communications officer, came down the hold ladder with the look she gets when something has happened that is going to require paperwork. There's a situation, she said. There usually is. The Velsorath had a cascade failure on approach. I set down the load sheet. The Velsorath was the Sethali Compact's new fast courier vessel, the flagship of their most recent construction program, commissioned about 8 months before we left Mauritius, and notable primarily for the fact that the Compact had issued a transit bulletin about it when it launched that was 4 pages long, and included, in the third paragraph, a direct comparison to older generation vessels in the transit lanes that I had read once and not needed to read again. The comparison was politely phrased and technically accurate and communicated in the language of a document designed to communicate exactly what it was communicating without appearing to that the older generation of vessels was the older generation of vessels. I had read it in the context of a briefing on compact fleet developments. I had noted it. I had continued with the manifest. The Velsorath was, by every current metric of compact engineering, precisely what the Varanthi Hall was not: new, efficient, built to current specifications in every system, and designed according to principles that had been developed in the past decade rather than the past 7 decades. It had a cascade failure on approach to Kethvorath. What kind of cascade? I said. Navigation and docking system. It's holding a stable orbit, but it can't complete an automated approach sequence. The station's putting together a manual assist team, but it's going to take time. How much time? 18 to 30 hours minimum. Depends on how fast they can get the interface crew assembled and briefed. She paused. The Velsorath is the Compact's primary courier for this sector. It's carrying diplomatic mail and time-sensitive cargo from the Sethali homeworld. Understood. The Station Port Authority has issued a request to review all current berth assignments to see if a Priority 1 berth can be made available for priority docking. I put down the load sheet I was holding. Which berth are they reviewing? Marka looked at me with the expression of someone who knows the answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet. They've listed 3 options: berths 12, 31, and 47. 12 was currently occupied by a Vinvar convoy ship. 31 was occupied by a compact administrative vessel on a scheduled resupply run. 47 was ours. When did the request come in? 7 minutes ago. Captain Mossfeld is already on the comm with Port Authority. I picked up the manifest binder. I kept a physical binder on top of the digital record because digital records occasionally had technical issues and a physical binder never did. And I went up the ladder to the bridge. Vera was on the comm. She was using her weather report voice, which meant the conversation was being handled with the care that a person uses when they know they are talking to someone who is going to remember exactly what was said. On the other side of the comm was a Sethali Port Authority administrator whose identification code put them at senior grade, which meant they had significant discretionary authority over berth assignments. Their name, which I caught from the comm identifier, was Sorith Callan. Captain Mossfeld. Sorith Callan was saying, through the translator matrix, the Port Authority is not issuing a displacement order at this time. We are conducting a voluntary review of berth availability under transit. Charter Emergency Protocol 7, which allows... I'm familiar with Protocol 7, Vera said, which allows the Port Authority to request voluntary relinquishment of berth assignment in cases of pressing priority need. The Velsorath situation qualifies under. The request is noted, Vera said. We're going to need a moment to consult our documentation before we respond. There was a pause. The situation is time-sensitive, Captain. I understand that. The documentation review won't take long. She muted the comm and looked at me. I already had the transit charter open to the right page. I laid it on the chart table. The relevant section was Charter Article 9, Grandfathered Priority Berth Assignments. Subsection 3, Rights and Protections. The text was dense. The charter had been written by a committee that took the position that ambiguity was a form of error and had therefore removed it wherever possible, but the substance was clear. A Priority 1 grandfathered berth assignment, once established under the original Transit Charter ratification, could not be involuntarily displaced without a formal appeals process before the Charter Review Panel, a process that required 14 working days minimum, and a majority ruling by the 5-member panel. Protocol 7. Voluntary relinquishment requests were applicable only where the current berth holder was not in active use of the berth at the time of the request. We were in active use of the berth at the time of the request. The Varanthi Hall had carried a Priority 1 grandfathered berth assignment at Keth Vorath since Compact Standard Year 4406, when she had been registered under the original Transit Charter as one of 23 vessels granted priority access under the Charter's founding provisions. The registration had been maintained continuously. The maintenance fees had been paid on schedule every year for 67 years. There were 67 years of unbroken payment records in the documentation, which I kept in a separate section of the manifest binder, because these were the kind of records that mattered. When a conversation like this one happened, I had put them there when I took the job. 3 years ago, the first week, going through the full documentation package for a ship I was going to spend years working on. The payment records were in there. The founding charter registration was in there. The Article 9 provisions were in there. I had read all of it, logged where everything lived in the binder, and then gone back to the manifest, because the manifest was the daily work, and the charter provisions were the foundation. The daily work stood on, and both of those things were true simultaneously. Vera read the section. She read it a second time. She looked at me. 14 days, she said, minimum. And they need a voluntary relinquishment, which we're not required to give. What happens to the Velsorath if they can't get a Priority 1 berth? I had already looked this up, because it was the obvious next question. They can manual assist her into a Priority 2 or Priority 3 berth. But their cascade failure has compromised the precision docking systems, and a Priority 2, K3 approach, with manual assist on a vessel that size is rated as elevated risk in the Port Authority's own operational guidelines. Not impossible, just not what they'd want. And if they wait for a Priority 1 berth through the formal process, 14 days, the Velsorath is in a stable orbit. It can hold that orbit for. I checked the data Marca had pulled. The engineering estimate is 72 hours before orbital decay starts to be a concern. After that, they'd need to boost to a higher orbit, which costs fuel and time, and they do that on a loop until they can get the berth. Or they do the elevated risk manual assist into a lower berth. Yes. Vera thought about this for a moment. What's our unload schedule? 3 days, assuming the construction panels proceed at current rate. The calibration equipment is more delicate. That'll take careful handling. Realistically, 3 days and change. She looked at the transit charter. She looked at me. She said, "We're going to complete the unload. I know. I want the documentation ready." "It's ready." She unmuted the comm. "Administrator Sorath Kalin," she said. "We've completed our documentation review. We're not in a position to voluntarily relinquish berth 47. We hold a Priority 1 grandfathered assignment under Charter Article 9, subsection 3, and we are in active use of the berth. If the Port Authority wishes to pursue formal displacement, we understand the process requires 14 working days and a Charter Review Panel ruling. We're sorry for the difficulty with the Velsorath. We hope the situation resolves quickly." There was a pause. The pause lasted long enough that the comm's ambient static became briefly audible, a faint white noise hiss that filled the channel in the absence of anything else. "Captain Mossfeld," Sorath Kalin said finally, "I want to be certain I understand your position correctly." "The position is the transit charter," Vera said. "It's not a position we chose exactly. It's just what it says." Another pause. "We will review our options, of course. We'll be here for approximately 3 days while we complete our unload." The comm closed. Vera looked at the ceiling of the bridge for a moment, a habit she had when she was processing something, and then she said, "Get me Delka." Our engineer came up from the engine compartment with grease on her forearms, and the patient expression of a woman who has been called up from the engine compartment more times than she can count, and has long since made her peace with it. Vera explained the situation. Delka listened. At the end, she said, "You want me to make sure everything runs perfectly for 3 days. I want you to make sure everything runs perfectly for 3 days. Define perfectly. No delays, no surprises, no reasons for anyone to say this unload isn't proceeding at standard pace." Delka nodded slowly. "We've got the drive coupling. Is it a problem right now?" "Not right now." "In 6 months." Different answer. "Right now, she's fine." "Then let's keep her fine." Delka said she would, and went back down to the engine compartment. I went back to the cargo hold and the manifest. What happened over the next 3 days is, in terms of events, not a complicated story. The Varanthi Hall completed her unload. The construction panels came off first. 412 units moved to the station's receiving warehouse in the standard sequence. Then the industrial sealant compound. 400 units of which had been designated for the Hadrith 9 relay project, and 12 of which, upon receipt inspection, were flagged by the station's receiving crew as showing minor container seam irregularities. Not a cargo failure on our end. The containers had sealed correctly when loaded, and the irregularities were a manufacture issue, but it required documentation and a variance report and a meeting with the station's cargo supervisor that took 2 hours and produced a paper trail that was, in my assessment, thorough to the point of being exhaustive. I wrote the variance report. I wrote it carefully and completely, because a variance report is a document, and a document that will be in a permanent record should be written to be in a permanent record. Meanwhile, the Velsorith held orbit. I became aware of this primarily through the station information feed, which updated the Velsorith's status periodically. The feed noted, in the neutral language of official status reports, that the Velsorith's manual assist interface team had assembled and conducted an initial approach assessment, and that the assessment had concluded that a manual assist approach to a Priority 2 or Priority 3 berth, given the current state of the Velsorith's docking system cascade damage, presented what the assessment termed an unacceptable risk profile. Under current conditions, the Port Authority was therefore pursuing alternative solutions. The feed also noted, in a separate entry that appeared 4 hours later, that the Sethali Compact Homeworld Administration had been notified of the Velsorith's status and was monitoring the situation with appropriate attention to the time-sensitive nature of the vessel's cargo. I read that line with the specific quality of attention I give to sentences that are saying something other than what they appear to be saying. Monitoring with appropriate attention to the time-sensitive nature was the polite version of people who matter are aware of this problem and expect it to be resolved. I filed that observation in the part of my mind where professionally relevant information goes, and continued unloading construction panels. I was not privy to what those alternative solutions were, except in the ways that information travels on a station. Through crew facilities, through the shared print terminal room, through the loading dock where station workers talk to ship crews, and ship crews talk to each other. What reached me through these channels was that the Sethali Port Authority had contacted the operators of berths 12 and 31 seeking voluntary relinquishment. Then that both had declined. Berth 12's operators, noting that they were also in active use of a grandfathered assignment, and Berth 31's operators, expressing polite regret and citing cargo handling requirements that made an early departure impractical, which left Berth 47 and the formal process, and 14 working days, the Velsorith boosted to a higher orbit on the afternoon of the first day. The station feed noted this as a routine operational adjustment, On the morning of the second day, Vereth-san came back. He came alone this time, without the junior inspectors or the recorder. He came to the cargo hold, where I was supervising the transfer of the calibration equipment. Delicate work, done in coordinated stages because some of the units were sensitive enough that a standard loading arm wasn't appropriate, and we were using the hand transfer protocol, which was slower but reliable. He stood at the hold entrance for a moment, the refraction shimmer moving along his joints in the way that indicated, according to the cultural briefing documents, something the documents described as recalibration of expectations. I finished logging a transfer unit before I looked up. "Cargo hand Okoro," he said. "Inspector Vereth-san." He looked at the calibration units being moved. He looked at the manifest in my hand. He said, "The unload is proceeding. It is. At standard pace. We don't rush calibration equipment. The handling spec says controlled transfer, and we do controlled transfer." He was quiet for a moment. The refraction pattern shifted again. "The Velsorith situation is..." "I'm aware of the Velsorith situation," I said. "I've been following the station feed. The orbital hold is sustainable, but there are practical constraints on duration." "Yes, the feed has that information too." He looked at me. The refraction narrowed in the way that the cultural documents associated with what they called direct engagement. A Sethali mode that meant the social register performance had been set aside in favor of plain communication. I found that mode easier to work with. "Is there a mechanism," he said, "by which this situation could be resolved in a way that is beneficial for both parties?" I thought about that for a moment. It was a real question, asked plainly, and it deserved a real answer. "There's one thing," I said. "I want to be clear that I'm speaking for myself, not for Captain Mossfeld, and that anything along these lines would have to go through her and through the station's administrative process. But the transit charter does have a provision for expedited, voluntary relinquishment, where the relinquishing party is compensated for the operational impact of early departure. Charter Article 9, Subsection 6. The compensation rate is set by the charter schedule." Vereth-san said, "What is the operational impact?" "We have calibration equipment that needs controlled transfer. At current pace, that's approximately 31 hours. If we had additional handling resources, specifically, the station's precision handling unit, which is usually reserved for compact registry vessels, we could potentially complete the transfer in 12 to 14 hours. He looked at the calibration units. He looked at me. "And if the compensation and the resources were made available, then Captain Mossfeld would have something to consider. Whether she'd consider it favorably, I can't say. That's her decision." He was quiet for a long time. The station sounds filled the silence. The low hydraulic hum of the loading cranes, the distant movement of other ships in the berth system, the ordinary ambient noise of a working port. "I will speak to the port authority," he said. "That seems like a reasonable next step." He left. I logged the conversation in the manifest binder, date, time, summary, my statement that I had been speaking personally, and not for the captain, and went up to brief Vera. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. At the end she said, "He asked you?" "He came down to the hold and asked me, not me. I think he assessed that you would be more formal about it. He wasn't wrong." She considered this. "The precision handling unit would get us done in 12 hours? 14 at the outside. The calibration units are sensitive, but they're not technically beyond the unit's capacity. We've just been using hand transfer because that's what we had available." "And the charter compensation schedule?" I had already looked it up. I gave her the figure. She looked at the ceiling again. "The Velsorith is carrying diplomatic mail and time-sensitive cargo," she said. "That's what Marca's report said. And if it stays in orbit another 2 days, it's not a safety issue at this point. It's a diplomatic and logistics issue." "Right." She looked at the ceiling a little longer. "You know what I'm going to say." "I think so. The Hall's been coming to Kethvorith for 19 years. We're going to keep coming to Kethvoreth after this. And the Sethali run this station, and they're going to remember how this went. And I'd rather they remember that we were reasonable about it, than that we were technically correct about it. We can be both, I said. The charter compensation is a real mechanism. Using it isn't a concession. No, she said. It's not. She straightened up. Tell Vareth-san that I'll speak with the Port Authority directly, and that I want the precision handling unit and the compensation in writing before we agree to anything. I'll pass that on. She went to the comm. I went back to the hold. The Port Authority's response came through in 2 hours, faster than I had expected, which said something about how the Velsorith situation was being treated on the compact side of the calculation. The response confirmed the precision handling unit, the charter compensation at the scheduled rate, and the formal voluntary relinquishment documentation that would be filed with the station registry. All of it, in writing, countersigned by Sorith Callan, and by Varathson acting in his capacity as Senior Compact Inspection Authority. Vera signed our side. I filed the documentation. The precision handling unit arrived at berth 47 at 0700 the next morning. The calibration equipment was transferred in 13 hours and 40 minutes. Every unit arrived at the station's receiving dock in perfect condition. I walked each transfer personally and logged each one because that was my job, and because when something matters you do it completely. The Velsoreth came into berth 47 at 2200 that evening on a manual assist approach that the station's interface team handled with evident care. I watched it from the station concourse. Not on purpose. I had been at the print terminal, updating the final manifest, and the approach trajectory was visible through the concourse windows. The Velsoreth was genuinely beautiful, the way new things are beautiful, clean lines, hull plating that caught the station lights without a mark on it, systems that, from the outside, showed no evidence of the cascade that had stopped her approach 2 days earlier. She came into berth, with the careful measured movement of a ship, being handled by people who were taking no chances, and the docking clamps settled around her with a solidity that said, "She's in." I went back to the print terminal and finished the manifest update. The haul departed Kethvoreth at 0600 2 days later, fully unloaded, and with an outbound cargo of compressed gas cylinders, medical supply containers, and a sealed diplomatic pouch we were carrying on a subcontract arrangement, to Orbital Station Ferrith 2, standard departure, standard clearance, nothing unusual in the process. Vera took us out of berth on the standard exit trajectory and handed off to the autopilot once we cleared the traffic control zone, and I sat down at the cargo table in the crew area and started the transit manifest for outbound run. 3 hours into the transit, the diplomatic pouch was logged in the sealed cargo record. 2 hours after that, our communications array, archaic in both design philosophy and operational idiom, fully functional and compliant, received a transmission from Kethvoreth Station Administration. Marka brought it to me. She had printed it, which was unusual. Marka was not a printer, she was a screen person, and she handed it to me without saying anything. It was on Compact Station Administration letterhead. The Kethvorath crest, the formal date in Compact Standard Notation, the administrative reference code in the upper right corner. It was addressed to the vessel Varanthi Hall, IMO registration Kareth, 64402 MG3, berth 47, Kethvoreth Station, most recent assignment. To the vessel. Not to the captain, to the vessel. I read that line twice. Then I read the rest of it. The text was brief. It acknowledged the events of the past 3 days, noted the voluntary relinquishment arrangement under Charter, Article 9, subsection 6, and confirmed that the compensation had been processed to the Hall's registered account. It then stated that the Kethvorath Station Administrative Registry had reviewed the Varanthi Hall's berth assignment to Seament documentation and confirmed that the Priority 1 grandfathered assignment at berth 47 was fully current and in compliance with all charter requirements, and it expressed, in the precise grammar of compact formal communication, the station's appreciation for the hall's professional conduct during an operationally complex period and its cooperative approach to the resolution of a situation in which the station authority's options were, on review, more constrained than initially assessed. More constrained than initially assessed. That was the compact's way of saying. We looked at the clause, and we found it was there, and we found it had been there for 67 years, and we found that the vessel we had described as conditionally compliant with minimum transit standards and whose berth assignment we had suggested reviewing for appropriateness had a legal standing in our own charter that we had not fully accounted for before it became the only question that mattered. The last line said, "This communication has been entered into the permanent Kethvorth station record under reference 4473 KV-ADM 447. Permanent station record, same registry as the inspection log. Same registry as Varathson's notation about the stress mark on the cargo hold panel, the surface oxidation on the heat exchanger housing, the non-standard bow profile, the archaic communications array. Same record, same permanence. I read it twice. I folded it along the print creases, which were clean, and even because the station's print terminal was a good one, I put it in the manifest binder, in the section behind the transit charter documentation, where I kept things that mattered and that I might need again. Then I went back to the transit manifest and started logging the outbound cargo. Pryor, who had apparently been watching from the galley doorway for some portion of this sequence, said, "Was that good news?" "It was a formal administrative communication," I said, "from the station." From the station. He thought about this. So it was good news. It was a formal administrative communication that has been entered into the permanent station record. He looked at me a moment with the expression he reserves for things he has decided he will never fully understand and has made his peace with. "You want tea? Please." He put the kettle on. I logged the medical supply containers. What I have thought about since, in the way you think about things that happened on a long transit when the autopilot is running, and there is nothing immediate requiring attention, is this: Varathson came to the cargo hold. He came alone, without the recorder, without the junior inspectors. He asked a plain question in the mode the Sethali use, when they have set aside the performance and want a real answer. And what that said, underneath all of it, was not that we had won something or that they had lost something, but that the situation had encountered a fact that nobody involved in it had fully priced in before it mattered. A fact that had been there for 67 years, sitting in the transit charter in the Sikanon grandfathered Priority 1 berth assignments. Doing nothing in particular, waiting. The inspection log still existed. Everything in it was still accurate. The stress mark on the cargo hold panel was still non-structural. The communications array was still archaic in both design philosophy and operational idiom. None of that had changed. What had changed was that the document sitting behind the inspections log in the binder, the founding charter registration, the 67 years of unbroken payment records, the Article 9 provisions in their dense and unambiguous prose, had become the relevant document, and all the others had become context. There is a thing I have noticed, over 3 years of keeping manifests and filing charter notations and cross-referencing load plans, about the relationship between documents and the people who read them. Most people read the document that seems important, and do not read the documents around it. They read the inspection log and not the founding registration. They read the approach assessment and not the operational guidelines. They read the summary and not the appendix. This is not stupidity. It is time and attention, which are finite, and which go where the visible urgency is. But the documents around the visible documents are still there. They have not changed. They are exactly what they were when someone wrote them. for exactly the reason that someone wrote them, and if you have read them, if you knew, going in, what the binder contained and where everything lived, then when the visible urgency arrives, you are simply ready. I had been ready. The binder had been ready. The Hall had been carrying that readiness in her paperwork for 67 years. The Hall had been coming to Kethforth for 19 years. She would keep coming to Kethforth. The apology was in the permanent record, and the birth assignment was confirmed, and the Vel Sorath was in berth 47 now, carrying its diplomatic mail wherever it was going next, which had nothing to do with us. The stress mark on the cargo hold panel was still there. The heat exchanger housing still had its oxidation patch. The bow profile was still aerodynamically unusual. She was 71 years old, and she had a Priority 1 grandfathered berth assignment at a Sathali compact transfer station, and she had held it for 67 of those 71 years, and it had never occurred to anyone in authority to ask why, until it was the only question that mattered. That seemed, to me, like a reasonable summary of the situation. Vera came to that cargo table on her way to the bridge for the watch change. She stopped when she saw the manifest binder open, and the printed letter folded inside it. That the station communication? Yes. Does it say what we expected? It says everything we expected, and also that it's in the permanent record. She looked at the binder for a moment. She looked at me. The expression she had was the one she uses for things that have gone as they should, and required nothing further. Good, she said, and went to the bridge. I closed the binder and put it on the shelf where it lived, between the load schedule for the outbound run and the maintenance documentation. The Hall settled into her transit rhythm. The familiar low vibration of the drives running well, the occasional adjustment of the autopilot's course correction, the domestic sounds of 11 people existing together in a hull that had been doing this work for longer than any of them had been alive. Somewhere below, I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of Delka running a routine diagnostic on the drive coupling, which she did every 72 hours on transit, which she had done every 72 hours for as long as I had known her, the sound of a person looking after a thing she knew how to look after. The kettle came to a boil. Pryor poured 2 cups. I wrapped my hands around mine and felt the warmth of it, and outside the porthole, the stars moved in their slow, unchanging way, and we ran on.